The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by saying that in regards to the Isur of Bishulei Nochrim, that means food that was cooked by a non-Jew, we learn out in a way of an asmachta, that means it's being used as a support, from the pasuk that says in this week's parsha, Oichel bakesef tashbireini v'yachalti umayim bakesef titan li v'shosisi, which means to say that the Yidden came to Sicha and Melech HaMoiri, to the nation of Hamoiri. They wanted to cross their land, and they were saying, we're going to buy your food and we're going to buy your water. But the Gemara learns out from this there's a certain comparison between the food and the water. We're putting them both together in this pasuk, because what kind of food are they going to buy from the Goyim? Clearly it's going to be kosher food. But there's a comparison made over here that just like water, even if you cook the water is always going to remain the same. In a similar way, what kind of food are they going to be buying from the Goyim? If it's going to be cooked food, it could only be the kind of food that wouldn't have changed based on cooking. And therefore, we learn out this concept that there's a problem with most foods. If a Goy is going to cook them, even if it's technically kosher food originally, the fact that a Goy cooked it is going to be a problem. Now, there's a machloikus amongst the poskim, whether kalim that absorbed inside of themselves from the cooking of a non-Jew, whether the keli is going to be asur, and therefore anything that you cook in the keli will be asur or not. So there are poskim that hold, since the whole isur of bishulakum, bishulei nochrim, is the concern is only b'kshim chasnas, we're afraid we're going to be eating the cooked foods of Goyim, we're going to be sitting down with them together and having a meal with them. Chas v'shalom, a Yid is going to end up intermarrying with a non-Jewish woman. So, if that's the reason, these Mefarshim, the poskim say, we're not going to be concerned if a person is going to eat food that's not cooked by the Goy, it's just cooked in a pot that had originally Bishul Akum in it. Because certainly just having this food now is not going to cause him to intermarry with a Goy. However, most poskim are of the opinion that the Kalim are Asur. Why? Because once the Chachamim placed an Isur on something, in other words, now this food that was cooked in the pot is asur because of bishul akum. So now it became like something completely asur, means it's as if it's inherently asur completely, and therefore, if this isur goes into the pot, it's now a dvar isur that's in the pot, and therefore anything going to be cooked in the pot could be a problem, and so on. An example for this concept that Rebbe says is similar to a din regarding the halachos of schacha v'sukkah. So you're not allowed to use pieces of wood, boards that are wide 4 tfachim. The halacha is that even if you take those boards, turn them over to the side, so now the side is thinner, there's no 4 tfachim there, it's still pasul. Because once this board is considered a pasul board, so now it's going to be pasul no matter how you use it. As the Ragat Shavar explains it, that when you have something that's asur, because of a gzeira, that we're concerned about something else that's asur, so in our case that is, you can't use the regular ceiling of a house for your schach. The concern over here when you use boards that are wide 4 tfachim is that it looks like the regular boards of a ceiling. We're concerned that you may end up using your ceiling as well. So even though that's the concern, but right now, even though it became asur because of a gzeira, but now this isur is going to apply even if technically the reason doesn't apply. In other words, we turned it over on the side, but the board became completely asur. Says the Rebbe the same thing over here. The reason for the Isur was because of Gzeira, because of Chasnus, because of not intermarrying with a Goyim. However, again, most of the poskim will hold that even in this case, it becomes mamish like the Isur itself, like food that's non-kosher, and therefore the Isur is going to apply even in the case where there's no concern of intermarrying. Says the Rebbe, via Shloimar, we could say that a source for this opinion of most of the poskim, we could bring a source from this, from a story at the end of Masechta Avodah Zarah, in connection to the halacha of how a knife needs to be kashered. If it was a knife that, again, absorbed something that was non-kosher, and you want to now use the knife to eat something cold with it. So we're going to learn how that's done and a story associated with this. And if we're going to learn this particular story, that the Isur in that case of that knife, what the problem was, not of non-kosher food, essentially, but it was kosher food, but it was just cooked by a goy, if we learn it that way, then quite a number of questions on the story will be solved. So the Rebbe over here is making a siyum on Masechta Avodah Zarah. The story goes as follows in the end of the Masechta. Mar Yehuda, an individual called Mar Yehuda, and someone called Bati Bartuvi were sitting in front of the king, a Persian king called Shvur Malka. A esrog was brought in front of the king. He takes off a slice, cuts off a slice and eats it himself. He cuts off another slice and gives it to this person, Bati Bartuvi. Then he takes the knife, he sticks it 10 times into the ground, as the Gemara says that in order to kasher a knife, so that's one of the ways of kashering the knife, is sticking it into hard earth 10 times. He now uses the knife and cuts off another piece of this esrog, and he gives it to Mar Yehuda to eat. So, Bati Bartuvi, who was just given the piece earlier without the knife being kasher in that way, so he turns to the king and he says, and what about me? Am I not Jewish? So now we're going to have two versions of what it is that the king responded. The first version is that he said that regarding Rav Yehuda, I'm certain that he is someone that stays away from all sorts of Isurim. He would never eat something that's Asur. But regarding you, I'm not so sure that you're so careful from Isurim. And this is why he kashered it for Mar Yehuda, but not for Bati Bartuvi. Then the Gemara says, Ikadamri, another opinion, says that what is it that Shvur Malka said? He says, Idkar, you should just remind yourself what it is that you did last night. And as Rashi explains, that it was a way of the Persians that they would give women to their guests. They would give them these women that they could entertain them with these women. And what happened was that the previous night, when these women were brought to both Rav Yehuda and to Bati, so Bati, he accepted this woman and he sinned with her, whereas Rav Yehuda didn't. So these are the two opinions in the Gemara of what it is exactly that Shvur Malka had responded, why he didn't kasher the knife for Bati. Now, when we learn the story simply, the difference between these two approaches, these two opinions of what it is that Shvur Malka actually said, according to the first opinion, what the king said was, I'm not so sure about you, whether you stay away from Isurim. In other words, I'm sure Mar Yehuda stays away from Isurim, I'm just not sure about you. Whereas according to the second opinion, he's actually certain that Bati does not stay away from Isurim. He's telling him, remember what you did last night with this woman. But if that's the case, says the Rebbe, the question is, it's completely not understood. Since Bati actually had accepted those Persian women the previous night, and he was over on an absolute Isur, so the question over here is, why is the first opinion saying that what Shvur Malka said is only, I'm not sure about you, whether you're careful in these Isurim? Because, says the Rebbe, it's difficult to say that there's a machloikus over here whether the story happened the previous night. In other words, they're not arguing whether the story happened the previous night or not. What they're just arguing is which argument Shvur Malka actually said. Was it that I'm not sure whether you're careful with Isurim of eating? Or did he tell him, or just remember what you did last night? So again, the question that Rebbe is asking, if there's some actual factual story that this Bati did, why does the first opinion not quote that story? That Shvur Malka would have quoted that story. So the Rebbe now looks at a different approach between Rashi and Tosfos, first of all. And the Rebbe says, Tosfos actually says that Bati had actually not sinned by accepting these Persian women the previous night. Why? Because Bati was actually an Eved, he was a slave. But he wasn't, at this point, considered a full slave. He was only partially a slave. That is, that he was free to a certain extent, but he wasn't given yet his shtar shichrur, that document that actually releases him, which would have made him a complete free slave. Now again, reminding ourselves the halachos, we're not speaking about a Yiddish slave, we're speaking about a slave that was a goy, but upon release, he's now going to be a full Yid. At this point, according to Tosfos, an Eved that's partially a slave and partially not, would be mutter, would actually be allowed to live with this non-Jewish woman. The Rebbe also looks at, the Rebbe is going to get back to Tosfos soon, but first the Rebbe is going to look at Rashi. The Rebbe says Rashi doesn't mention anything about the fact that there was no Isser over here. It seems to be that according to Rashi, Bati had actually done something wrong. And the Rebbe says that we could explain this difference between Rashi and Tosfos, that it's based on actually another disagreement that Rashi and Tosfos have regarding a slave that's not completely free. The halacha is, the Gemara says, that if a person says, Nisya'ashti meploini avdi, I've totally given up on this particular lost hope, totally given up on this slave that I have, which as explained over there means that it's as if he made him hefker, completely free. That means he's free on to go. So the Gemara says, such a slave, ein loy takana ela bishtar. He has no takana, he has no remedy. This is referring to the area of marriage, who he could marry. In other words, the only way he'll be able to marry someone, as we'll discuss in a moment what that means, is only if he also gets the shtar, that document that actually releases him. This is Masechta Gittin. So we have over here machloikas between Rashi and Tosfos. What does it mean, ein loy takana? Rashi says, this man, because he doesn't have the shtar shichrur, he was released on the one hand, but he doesn't have the shtar shichrur, so he can't marry neither a Jewish woman or a shifcha, another maidservant or a goyish woman. Why? Because he's partially released and partially not. Tosfos, however, over there learns different to Rashi. And he says, ein loy takana means that he's not allowed to marry a regular Jewish woman, a free Jewish woman, but a shifcha, a non-Jewish maidservant, this kind of eved that's partially released would be allowed to marry. So applying that back to our case, to Bati, since Bati was a person that he did not get that shtar shichrur, so again, according to Rashi, he wouldn't be allowed to marry anyone. He wouldn't be allowed to live with anyone, not with a Jewish woman, not with a non-Jewish woman, or the shifcha. And therefore Rashi is saying over here that he would have been usher to that. According to Rashi, what Bati did would have been forbidden. But according to Tosfos, if he does not have the shtar shichrur, so he's partially a slave, partially not, he would be allowed to live with a shifcha as well as a goyish woman. But now let's focus again back on the general story, and according to the way Tosfos understands it, that according to Tosfos, Bati had actually not done anything wrong the night before, because he's partially an eved, and he was allowed to live with this Persian woman. So then the question is, if Bati in fact was not over on any isur, so why is it that Shvur Malka is accusing him and saying, oh, doesn't matter, I could give you this non-kosher food anyways, because you remember what you did last night. Well, he didn't do anything wrong last night. Again, just as a reminder, even an eved has to eat kosher food, etc., especially especially he's partially released now and so on. The Rebbe doesn't go into that over here. So the Rebbe says, the Ritva says that Shvur Malka just simply didn't know this, and therefore he suspected him. He says, just like you weren't careful of the goyish woman, so too, he's not going to be careful about this food that was coming from a goyish place. But the truth of matter says, as the Ritva explains, that that's not the case, because an Eved is warned in all sorts of Isurim, and just like he's not allowed to eat chazer, he's not allowed to eat nevela, he's also not allowed to eat from any utensils and pots that were used with these non-kosher foods. But the Rebbe says, seemingly, this explanation is not so simple and not so smooth. Because Shvur Malka, as we know from other places, and it's evident also from this story itself, was actually Baki Bedinim. He knew the halachos. So it doesn't seem logical to say that he didn't know this halacha, that the Eved is allowed to live with this non-Jewish woman. The Rebbe says it's also difficult to say that he didn't know the fact that Bati was partially an Eved, because as the Rebbe says, the Gemara tells over that Rav Yehuda had actually publicized about this. Barabim. The Rebbe says there's some other things in the details of the story that we need to understand. And the Rebbe asks as follows. All is well the fact that Bati took the esrog from Shvur Malka, and, as it sounds from the story, he actually went ahead and ate it. So we can understand and we can explain it simply that why did he actually go ahead and do it? Not because he was not careful in the food that's coming from goyish utensils, etc., which could be a problem of that absorb treif and so on, or because he didn't know the halachos of giyulei nachrim, that even a fruit, but if it's being used with utensils of non-kosher food, is going to be a problem. Because from the fact that he says, am I not Jewish, it's understood that he clearly knows these halachas and it's bothering him. So he's clearly bothered by this. So why is it that he ate from it? Because he's making the calculation, if he's not going to eat what the king gives him, it's going to be considered very, very offensive to the king. It's like a merida b'malchus, and it might be a case of pikuach nefesh. His life might be in danger because of this, and we know that pikuach nefesh is doiche kol ha'torah kula. We have the concept that in most things, we say, Yavor, you should do the Aveda rather than letting yourself be killed. But the question is going to be, says the Rebbe, regarding Shvur Malka himself. But first the Rebbe says, this is not a contradiction to the fact that later, once Shvur Malka does protect Mar Yehuda from the Isur, he does say, what, am I not Jewish? In other words, why are you not taking care of me as well? Bati Bartuvi. So obviously it's not a contradiction. Originally he eats it because it would be a case of pikuach nefesh, but later when he sees the king doing this, so then he's wondering why the king didn't try to do it for him as well. But the question does become again on Shvur Malka himself. Number one, says the Rebbe, if Shvur Malka clearly does not want to be machshil someone with an isur, he doesn't want to cause someone to do an isur, so the question then is just because he's not sure if Bati is careful with these Isurim, is that a reason enough to be machshil him, to cause him to eat a Dvar Isur? Just because he's not sure whether he cares about the Dvar Isur? Says the Rebbe, even according to the next opinion, that says that Bati was certainly someone that did do an Isur the previous night with that woman. Whether, according to Rashi, in fact, he did do an Aveira, or as we said, according to Tosfos, that he only thinks he did an Aveira, but really there was no Aveira even because he was allowed to live with this woman because he was an Eved. Even if that's the case, that's still not a reason to cause him to do another Isur. It's possible that Bati Taka couldn't control himself that previous night from this big Yetzer Hara, very, very big challenge of this Aveira, of living with this woman. And nevertheless, he is careful with non-kosher foods. Especially, says the Rebbe, that the Isur of Znus with a non-Jewish woman, they're not marrying, and it's only Bitzina, it's considered an Isur Midrabanon, whereas Giyulei Nachrim, eating from the utensils that had non-kosher, hot food, etc., is Isur Min HaTorah. So it could be he just couldn't control himself in that Isur, but why is that a reason that he's going to eat non-kosher now? The Rebbe says the question is even stronger. Since Shvur Malka is anyways kashering the knife, sticking the knife 10 times into the ground for Mar Yehuda, he could have so easily done it a few moments earlier before he gives Bati from the Esrog. And in that way, he's going to protect Bati from the Isser as well. Why is he delaying sticking the knife into the ground only after giving Bati to eat something that's Asr? So now the Rebbe goes back to what we said before. That is, that till now we were assuming, and this is the way many people learned this Gemara, that what this knife was used with previously was with non-kosher food. But now the Rebbe is going to go back to what we spoke before about Bishul Akum. And the Rebbe says the explanation of it is like this. But by first prefacing that the Isur, again, of this knife was not because of general Ma'acholis Asuris, non-kosher food. In other words, that it absorbed from foods in Shvur Malkus's palace. Says the Rebbe, because being a melech, and as the expression is klum chaser lebeis hamelech, is anything lacking in the house of the king. In the house of the king, everything is in an abundant way. Says the Rebbe, it doesn't make sense to say that they're going to be using in the palace the same knife to cut fruits, in this case the esrog, the same fruit knife that's usually used to cut hot meat or other similar foods. Surely there were special fruit knives, and therefore the knife had no problem with non-kosher food. What was the issue with the knife? It was the issue was, again, because Bishul Akum. It was because of cutting fruit, cooked fruit, and fruit that was charif, that has a certain sharpness to it. And therefore, when the knife had absorbed, the problem was bishulei nachrim, the concept of bishul akum. That's what it had absorbed. Which again, going back to the beginning of the Sicha, this was the topic that we started speaking about. That there are most of the poskim say. We explained that even for bishul akum, there's going to be a problem with the utensils that were used with it. So if we learn that this was the story over here, now all the questions will become clarified. Says the Rebbe says, now we can understand why, again, the second opinion in the Gemara. What does Shvur Malka say? Itkar, remind yourself what you did last night. Says the Rebbe like this. We said earlier that what's the reason for the Isser of Bishul Akum? Is because we're concerned that if you're going to eat cooked foods with the goyim, etc., could chas v'shalom lead to intermarriage. However, if Bati himself, according to Tosfos, is allowed to live with a non-Jewish woman, he's allowed to marry a non-Jewish woman. So if that's the case, there's no Isur of Bishul Akum. The whole point of Bishul Akum was because of the concern you might marry a non-Jewish woman, but for someone that there's no Isur to marry a non-Jewish woman, there's not going to be an Isur of Bishul Akum. And even though we said, as we said before, that once something is Asur because of Bishul Akum, it's going to become like the actual Isur itself, as we explained in the beginning of the Sicha, and it's going to remain Asur, even in a case where technically the reason doesn't apply. But that's not the same in our case in the story of Bati. And the Rebbe says 2 points. Number one, says the Rebbe, this idea that we say that something becomes like the Isur itself, that's only shayach when you're speaking about a particular item, a particular piece of food, a particular object, or whatever it is. And we're going to say that once it became asur, it's going to become asur in every single situation. Whereas in a case that seichel will dictate, logic will dictate, that the isur lechatchila doesn't even apply to this thing, because the whole reason for the isur in this case totally doesn't apply, and as in our case itself, we can understand that the concept of the Isser of Bishul Nachrim is not going to apply in certain cases, because in certain areas we say there's no concern at all of the Isser of Chasnas of intermarriage, and therefore in our case it wouldn't apply to Bati. But in addition to this, says the Rebbe, the fact that we say that the Isser remains, even when the reason for the Isser is Batul, only means that there's no chashash. In other words, what did we say before? Even if it's in a case that there's no actual worry that you're going to get married, nevertheless, the actual Isser of Chasna still exists. In other words, we might say about a certain thing that even if we're not worried in this case it's going to lead to marriage, the object is still going to be Usr. But what about if there's no problem with a marriage at all? In our case, by Bati, there is no Isser of marriage. So there's no room to say, it doesn't make sense to say, that the Isser of Chasnas, the Isser of marriage doesn't apply. That's mutter for Bati. And yet he should be Usr to have Bishul Akum, which might lead to marriage. That was according to Tosfos. What about according to Rashi? So the Rebbe explains it now, a very interesting thing as well. The Rebbe says similarly, when we speak about what Shvur Malka is saying, according to Rashi, what he says, remind yourself what you did last night, which according to Rashi we said, he was mamish over on an Isur by living with a non-Jewish woman, even though he's an Eved, or partially an Eved. So according to this, what Shvur Malka is saying, if the whole point of the Isur of Bishul Akum is only to protect you from a non-Jewish woman, so Shvur Malka is of the opinion it doesn't make sense to try to protect Bati from the fence for this Isur. In other words, for Bishul Akum that might lead you to intermarriage, if you're not even caring and not even careful about living with a non-Jewish woman at all. What's the point of making the Gzeda for it? Says the Rebbe, now we could explain. We asked a question before, why does the first opinion that says, I'm not sure how careful you really are with eating Devorim Asurim, why don't they say, we asked before, why don't they say the clear fact? Why didn't that Shvur Malka just clearly said, yes, you were over Isur last night? So now the Rebbe is going to look at that there's really another reason for Bishul Akum that's brought. Besides the reason for the concern of intermarriage, there's another reason. And that is, we're concerned that if a Yid's going to be eating with a Goy, so it could end up that the Goy is going to give him something non-kosher to eat. In other words, nothing to do with intermarriage. We're actually concerned of him ending up eating something non-kosher. Says the Rebbe, these two opinions in the Gemara of what it is that Shvur Malka said, I'm not sure whether you're careful, how careful you are of what you eat, Yisurim, or whether he told him directly you did an Isser last night by living with this non-Jewish woman, is actually the difference between these two opinions is dependent on what they consider the main reason for Bishul Akum. According to the second opinion story in the Gemara, the second version in the Gemara, that what he said was what you did last night, according to them, the main concern is actually marriage. And therefore, when he says, Itkar Mai, remind yourself what you did last night, so that's now going to explain, as we said before, why there's no concern. Why Shvur Malka is saying there's no concern of you eating from that food. Again, the two reasons are either, according to Tosfos, because if he's even allowed to marry a non-Jewish woman, so surely there should not be any reason for him not to have Bishul Akum, which is about leading to marrying non-Jewish woman. According to Rashi, slightly different, that if you don't care anyways about living with non-Jewish woman, so then what's the point of being careful with Bishul Akum? But according to the first explanation of the Gemara, the first explanation was that I'm not sure whether you're careful in Yisurim, meaning about eating Asr food. So according to the first opinion, the main reason for Bishul Akum was this concern about not coming to eat non-kosher food. So if that's the case, what is the point of mentioning what he did last night? It has nothing to do with living with non-Jewish women. The whole point of Bishul Akum is only the concern of eating non-kosher food, and that's what Shvur Malka is telling him. The Isser is about non-kosher food, and therefore I'm not sure whether you're careful. However, says the Rebbe, there's still a problem. According to this opinion, that says that the whole Isser is mitzad, the concern of not eating kosher food. And Shvur Malka is saying, look, I'm not even sure if you care about not eating non-kosher food. The problem is, just because I'm not sure, is that an excuse to cause you to eat something Asr? Another question that Rebbe has is, according to Rashi, and the second opinion about what he did last night, the problem is, so yes, even if Bati is not careful with living with a non-Jewish woman, and therefore there's no absolute necessity for Shvur Malka to try to protect him from the siyog, from Bishul Akum, which would lead to marrying non-Jewish woman. But still, wouldn't have it been better that he still takes that knife and kashers it before he gives Bati to eat from this esrog? So just do it a little bit earlier. There's no extra bother over here. He's going to do it anyways for Mar Yehuda. So just do it earlier, and in that way, Bati will also avoid this Isser. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, we have a halacha. Parnas shenismana al hatzibur, someone that was appointed with a high position over the community, is now no longer allowed to do melacha in front of people, in front of three people. Certainly a melech is not allowed to do melacha in front of people. The Rebbe says, even though we're speaking about a goy over here, Shvur Malka was a goy, the halacha is, this halacha is not just a halacha that we don't understand the reason. It's a milsa b'taima. It's a halacha that we can understand the reason. And this reason applies fully to a goyish king as well, and especially the way the goyish king is going to act concerning himself. In other words, we understand this concept that we need to have the respect for the king, and in fact, Yidden are chayiv in the respect for goyish kings as well. And the Rebbe explains, because this idea of having that full respect, the Rebbe says, Kavod HaMelech is something that's negeya to what's called Yishuvoy Shaloilam. In other words, for the world to be a proper, normal place to live in. Because as the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, if not for fear of the government, then people would be swallowing each other alive. Bnei Noach are also obligated to this, and therefore, the chiyuv of kavod applies to Yidden as well, even on the non-Jewish kings. Says the Rebbe, following from this logic, so as because of kavod hamelech, again the king not working, not putting himself down, degrading himself in front of other people, Shvur Malka was actually not allowed to stick this knife into the ground in front of Bati and Mar Yehuda, to do this work, this assistance for Bati and Mar Yehuda. And furthermore, says the Rebbe, since Bati is going to eat the esrog anyways, even without it being stuck on the ground, he's not going to be over any isser with this. And therefore, says the Rebbe, Adarab, he's actually chayiv to eat it because of a concern of pikuach nefesh. And if he's going to eat it anyways, and he has to eat it because of this chash of pikuach nefesh, Shvur Malka is now not going to be allowed to stick it into the ground for him. He gives it to him without sticking it into the ground. So why is he doing it for Mar Yehuda? So what does he say to Mar Yehuda? About you, I'm certain that you wouldn't eat this. What's he saying? He's not only saying, I'm sure that you wouldn't eat a Dvar Isur, and about Bati, I'm not sure whether he'd eat a Dvar Isur. What he's saying is, I'm sure about Mar Yehuda that there's no way he's going to eat from this Esrog, even if Min Hadin he's allowed to eat from it, because of this situation that the king is giving it to him and so on and so forth, and even if there's a concern of Pikuach Nefesh. He might even lose his life over it. I'm sure that Mar Yehuda is still not going to eat it from it. The Rebbe says, especially if we want to say that this is the same Rav Yehuda that the Gemara says about him, that he's from those earlier people that would be Moiser Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, and even in cases where they're not chayiv for it. So now Shvur Malka is, so to speak, obligated to kasher the knife for him, because he's not going to eat it in any other way, even if it's going to cost him his life. Whereas for Bati, since I'm not sure about him, says Shvur Malka, what is he not sure about? It's not about that he's not sure whether he's going to separate from Isurim Chas v'Sholem, but rather he's not sure whether Bati would be Moiser Nefesh for such a thing. So as a king, he's not allowed to give up of this honor and do malacha of sticking it into the ground for him. And the Rebbe concludes with a powerful hero in Avodas Hashem. The Rebbe says, what do we have over here? In front of Shvur Malka are sitting two Jews, two people, that are both obligated in the covet and the honor of the king. One of them is sitting in fright for this non-Jewish king, and as a result of this, he's eating from the fruit that Shvur Malka has cut for him with a knife that's not kosher. He's finding a heter for it, there's pikuach nefesh and all of that. But this Yid doesn't get the proper respect and from the king. It's Dafka, the second Jew, that Shvur Malka is certain about him, that he's not going to be over an Isur, even if he's going to offend the king. It's going to be Nogay in the Kavod HaMelech. Even to the extent of Mesiras Nefesh, he's even going to be ready to lose his life for it. Specifically, this Yid, not only does he find favor in the king's eyes, but on the contrary, Shvur Malka himself gives up on his honor, and he goes through the bother to go and do the work for Mar Yehuda and kasher the knife for him. Seemingly, he could have called in one of his misharsim and asked one of his assistants, one of his servants, to stick the knife into the ground, or even to ask Mar Yehuda to do it himself. What do we see over here? That when a goy sees in front of himself a yid that's a Yerei Shomayim, someone that's staying away from Yisurim to the extent of Mesiras Nefesh, then the goy considers it as an honor to himself and the honor of the king to be able to assist, to be able to serve this person. And not only to serve him, but to actually help him along physically and in all the Hidurim al Pidin, to be able to do everything in the most proper way. That Mar Yehuda should be able to eat this esrog. Sorry, because as we said before, Mar Yehuda was able to eat this esrog, even without sticking in the ground because of Kavod HaMelech, etc., etc. And yet here he's helping this Yid, Rav Yehuda, to be able to do it with all the Yidurim, not relying just on these Eterim. Says the Rebbe, and through this Hanaga, we actually have the Siyum for Avodah Zarah. That is, we're mevatel all the inyanim of Avodah Zarah of the world, and it becomes V'hoisel Hashem Hamlucha in the whole world. V'hoya Hashem L'melech al kol haaretz b'karif mamash.